From above, Lake Mead no longer looks like a stable reservoir. It looks like water slowly retreating from its own boundaries. A massive white ring scars the canyon walls, a visible line marking where the lake once stood. But what's more disturbing isn't the shoreline, it's what's happening inside it. Recent footage shows fish dying at an alarming rate, drifting silently across shrinking water. No storm, no sudden disaster, just a steady, unnatural decline. Look closer, and this stops feeling like a normal environmental cycle. This is not a seasonal drop. This is not a temporary drought. The patterns don't reset, they accelerate. What used to be fluctuations are now turning into a one-direction collapse. And the lake is starting to expose more than just rock. For decades, Lake Mead has been one of the most critical water sources in the United States, supporting millions of people, major cities, and vast agricultural systems. But now, something deeper is shifting, something structural. And the signs are no longer subtle. The real question isn't how low the water will go. The real question is, what happens when the system behind it can no longer function? Subscribe now and stay updated with the most critical developments unfolding right now. Like and share this video to keep more people informed about what's coming next. At its peak, Lake Mead was not just a reservoir, it was a cornerstone of modern life across the American Southwest. When it reached full capacity in the early 1980s, it held nearly 29 million acre-feet of water, enough to supply entire states and sustain rapid urban expansion. Cities like Las Vegas and Phoenix didn't just grow near this system, they were built because of it. Today, that foundation is visibly weakening. Lake Mead has dropped to roughly 1/3 of its total capacity. The stark white bathtub ring rising along the canyon walls now stretches more than 170 feet above the current waterline, a permanent visual record of loss. From the air, it looks like a scar across the landscape. From the ground, it reshapes the entire geography, exposing terrain that hasn't been seen in decades. This reservoir is directly or indirectly tied to the water supply of around 40 million people. It supports not only cities, but also one of the most productive agricultural regions in North America. Every drop that disappears carries consequences far beyond the shoreline. And yet, despite the scale of this decline, the broader perception has fully caught up with reality. Because what's happening here doesn't behave like a normal cycle. It's not just shrinking. It's revealing something much bigger underneath. If you're following this closely, leave a 9 in the comments. To understand why this situation is becoming critical, you first need to understand how Lake Mead was designed to function. It is not just a body of water, it is a control mechanism. Built behind the Hoover Dam, the reservoir acts as a buffer between unpredictable natural supply and fixed human demand. In simple terms, when snowpack in the Rocky Mountains is high and river flow increases, excess water is stored in Lake Mead. During dry periods, that stored water is released downstream to support cities, farms, and energy production. For decades, this system appeared stable. Wet years refilled the reservoir, dry years drew it down. The cycle repeated, and growth continued. But this balance depends on one critical assumption: that the long-term average flow of the Colorado River can consistently meet the levels promised and required. And that assumption is where everything begins to break, because the system was never designed for a permanent decline. It was built to smooth out temporary fluctuations, not to absorb a continuous shortfall year after year. Now, instead of balancing extremes, Lake Mead is being forced to compensate for a gap that never closes. The roots of this crisis trace back to a single decision made more than a century ago. In 1922, 7 U. states and the federal government signed the Colorado River Compact, a legal agreement that would divide the river's water and define the future of the entire Southwest. The number they agreed on became the foundation of everything that followed. The river was estimated to provide around 17.5 million acre-feet of water each year, and that amount was split between the upper and lower basin states, with additional commitments layered on top. Cities grew, farms expanded, and infrastructure was built based on that promise. But there was a problem. The data used to calculate that number came from an unusually wet period, a short window, in the early 20th century, when river flow was significantly higher than normal. Long-term records, reconstructed later through tree ring analysis, show a very different reality. The true average flow of the Colorado River is closer to 13 million acre-feet per year. That gap, more than 4 million acre-feet annually, was not a small error. It was a structural overestimation built directly into law. Some engineers at the time raised concerns. They warned the dataset was too limited. But the pressure to reach an agreement was stronger than the caution. And so, the system moved forward. For decades, Lake Mead absorbed the difference quietly. Now it no longer can. For much of the 20th century, the imbalance remained hidden. Wet years periodically refilled the system, and Lake Mead quietly compensated for the difference between what was promised and what the river could actually deliver. But around the year 2000, the pattern began to shift. Snowpack in the Rocky Mountains, the primary source of the Colorado River, started to decline. Annual inflows dropped below long-term averages, and the reservoir stopped recovering between dry periods. At first, the changes were subtle. Water levels fell by just a few feet each year, barely noticeable against the scale of the lake. Then the decline accelerated. By the early 2010s, Lake Mead had dropped to levels not seen since it was first filled. By 2021, federal authorities declared the first official water shortage on the Colorado River, triggering mandatory cuts. Within a year, the situation escalated further. What changed was not just the numbers, it was the interpretation. Officials stopped describing the situation as a temporary drought. Instead, they began using a different term: aridification. This is not a short-term disruption that will reset with time. It signals a long-term shift toward a drier baseline, one that the system was never built to handle. The danger at Lake Mead is not just about how much water remains, it's about how close the system is to critical thresholds built into the dam itself. Hoover Dam was engineered to perform two essential functions: generate electricity and release water downstream. Both depend entirely on maintaining sufficient water levels. The first warning line sits at around 950 feet. As the lake drops toward this level, the pressure driving the turbines begins to weaken. Power generation becomes less efficient, and mechanical risks increase. Hoover Dam supplies electricity to more than 1 million people across Nevada, Arizona, and California. A sustained drop below this threshold doesn't just reduce output, it strains the entire regional power grid. But the real point of failure lies lower. At approximately 895 feet, Lake Mead reaches what engineers call dead pool. This is the level where water can no longer flow through the dam by gravity. No flow means no electricity. No downstream supply. The river, in effect, stops at the dam. Between these two levels is a narrow functional margin, a decline zone of roughly 55 feet, where system performance steadily degrades. Each foot lost reduces efficiency, flexibility, and control. Right now, Lake Mead is only about 50 to 60 feet above that critical cutoff. In a series of dry years, that buffer can disappear far faster than most people expect. As Lake Mead continues to fall, the pressure is no longer theoretical, it is already reshaping how major cities survive. Las Vegas is one of the clearest examples. Nearly 90% of its water supply comes from Lake Mead. Without it, the city as it exists today would not function. Recognizing the risk early, Southern Nevada water authorities made a decision that no other major user attempted at the same scale. They built a third intake tunnel, a deep water access system, designed to reach below the lowest traditional intake levels. Completed in 2015 at a cost of roughly $1.5 billion, it allows Las Vegas to continue drawing water, even if lake levels fall below critical thresholds where other systems fail. That investment was not optional. It was a direct response to a scenario they believed was likely. Other regions are not as protected. Phoenix, for example, relies heavily on the Central Arizona Project, a vast canal system that transports water from the Colorado River. But Arizona holds a lower priority under the original allocation agreements. When shortages are declared, it is among the first to face mandatory cuts. The result is a growing imbalance. Some cities are preparing for survival. Others are already being forced to adapt with fewer options and less control over what happens next. As shortages deepen, one of the most difficult realities begins to surface. Most of the Colorado River's water is not used by cities. It is used by agriculture. Roughly 80% of the river's allocation goes to farming, much of it in regions that depend entirely on large-scale irrigation. In places like California's Imperial Valley, desert land has been transformed into one of the most productive agricultural zones in North America. Vast fields produce winter vegetables and, more importantly, water-intensive crops like alfalfa type of hay primarily used to feed livestock. These crops generate strong economic returns, and in many cases they are exported overseas. This creates a striking imbalance. While urban areas are being asked to conserve shorter showers, reduced outdoor watering, stricter regulations, enormous volumes of water continue to flow into crops that never directly serve the populations facing restrictions. The system is not broken at the level of individual behavior. It is operating exactly as the legal structure allows. Water rights, established decades ago, prioritize agricultural use over newer urban demand. Changing that structure is not simple. It involves contracts, property rights, and political negotiations across multiple states. So the question becomes unavoidable. In a system with less water than promised, who gets to keep using it, and who is forced to give it up? It's as Lake Mead continues to recede, it is exposing more than just dry rock. The falling waterline is uncovering objects that were never meant to be seen again. Boats that sank decades ago now rest on open ground, Their frames cracked and bleached under the desert sun. Old intake structures and submerged foundations are reappearing, marking a past when the lake was full and the future felt secure. But some discoveries are far more unsettling. Human remains have been found along the newly exposed shoreline, some from accidental drownings, others linked to cases that were never resolved. In one instance, a body was discovered inside a metal barrel, preserved for decades beneath the water. As levels drop, more sites like this are beginning to surface. These findings are not just isolated incidents. They mirror something larger. For years, Lake Mead concealed the gap between expectation and reality, the difference between how much water was promised and how much actually existed. The reservoir masked those contradictions. Now, as the water disappears, so does the illusion. What was hidden is being revealed layer by layer. What is happening at Lake Mead is no longer a temporary disruption. It is a structural shift that forces a decision the system has avoided for more than a century. The gap between what was promised and what the river can deliver has not closed, it has widened. And the reservoir that once absorbed that difference is running out of capacity to do so. From here, there are only two realistic paths forward. The first is a controlled restructuring. That would mean renegotiating long-standing water agreements, reducing allocations across multiple sectors. And accepting that the scale of growth seen in the 20th century cannot be sustained under current conditions. It would involve difficult trade-offs: less water for agriculture, tighter limits for cities, and a complete recalibration of expectations. The second path is a crisis-driven collapse. If water levels continue to fall toward critical thresholds, the system will begin to fail in sequence. Power generation will decline. Water deliveries will be restricted. Cities and regions will compete for shrinking resources, not through planning, but through necessity. At that point, the outcome is no longer coordinated, it is reactive. The distance between today's level and the point of failure is measured in tens of feet. In unfavorable years, that margin can disappear quickly. This is no longer a distant scenario. It is a countdown already in progress. Stay ahead of critical updates as they unfold. Subscribe to the channel for clear, data-driven breakdowns of major events impacting millions. Turn on notifications so you never miss urgent developments. Like and share to help others stay informed and understand what's really happening.